Is privatization of education how American schools will be fixed? By Gadensi John. In recent years, there has been a major push to privatize education. It is no secret that education needs major reform, and many political heads and organizations believe privatization is a way to fulfill that desire. This presentation will explore the background of the movement to privatize education, as well as examine the opposing sides for the issue. Personal perspectives will also be peppered out through the narrative of my very own experience as a future educator. At this point, you might be wondering, what even is a privatized education? What does it look like? What would that mean for public schools? How would privatization of education affect the education system as a whole? Let us examine these questions in the preceding slides. Contrary to popular beliefs, the calls for privatizing education are actually not new at all. In 1955, economist Milton Friedman argued that taxpayer-funded vouchers should support parents in their choice of schools. Yet, over the next 4 decades, 26 states and the District of Columbia brought the voucher issue to voters via referenda to change their constitutions on the separation clause. All of these failed. On the other hand, public education has long been considered an essential pillar to a democratic society. Operating under an open-door policy, public schools accept any child regardless of disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or language barrier. More than 90% of U.S. students attend public schools, which continue to be underfunded by both federal and state coffers despite the ever-increasing demands placed upon them. Shifting much-needed resources toward private schools seems counterintuitive, many believe. So overall, the cost to keep public schools public and the cost to shift public schools into being privatized has been around for a very, very long time. When we begin to think of schools as business, then test scores are a measure of profitability. Indeed, students of teachers who get high achievement scores are rewarded in the same way that employees earn bonuses. But when scores are low, it is analogous to an unprofitable business, which might mean layoffs, store closings, and fired staff, says Hazard in his 2012 article. Under the conservative viewpoint the privatization of education is necessary because that is what will allow it to reach its full efficiency. On the other hand, those who oppose privatization of education stipulate that George W. Bush's administration's signature rewrite of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act demanded increasingly stiffer accountability for student achievement from public schools and teachers. Yet, that same public accountability strings do not attach to tax-funded vouchers going to private or religious affiliated schools. This irony is not lost on most public school supporters, which is why it's a major talking point. Let us take a look at some specific opposing viewpoints. One will be for the privatization of education, and the other one will argue against it. So for those who do not support the privatization of education, Lynn points out that there is absolutely no evidence that vouchers do much of anything except, in general, subsidize parents who are already paying something for private schools. In other words, students from low-income neighborhoods really wouldn't benefit as much as some people claim. On the other hand, those who support the privatization of education emphasize the fact that when public services undergo a privatization process, the result is often a greater efficiency in the implementation of needed resources. Most communities will see a significant reduction in the amount of taxes they pay for the service. Basically, only those who are consumers of the education would bear the cost. For some people, charter schools are viewed as a cure-all to raise test scores of American students, a remedy that will serve as an antidote for the ills of traditional public schools. Personally, I don't believe that is the case. In my experience, I personally went to a public school, but I had friends who went to some of the best charter schools. In my experience, we essentially all learned the exact same things, except their schools were highly unregulated, which eventually actually led many of them to return to the public schools. Statistics show that, on average, charter schools don't outperform public schools as people previously thought. Basically, privatizing education would only serve to make the rich richer and further limit the accessibility of education. So I would have to say no. I don't believe that education should be privatized, as every citizen deserves to have some sort of basic literacy. So, the question remains, is privatization of education how American schools will be fixed? Well, it depends on who you ask. Supporters for it argue that it will lead to a reduction in taxes and greater efficiency. On the other hand, those who oppose it argue that there's really no evidence that it works at all, and that it only further siphons money away from public schools. Basically, it all depends on who you ask.